want it after streaming, after it's not the recorded video, also let us know, and we will make sure that it is not in the video put online. Other than that, I will use time depth. So that sound maybe takes first 6 to 7 minutes, etc. Please also time yourselves and time each other. Other than that, we were very proud to announce the Prime Minister opening the debate on this House has allowed democratic governments to overturn the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court decisions with a simple majority of the legislature. Hear, hear! Yeah, fair enough. Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in the U.S. by the Supreme Court, it had previously decided that it was individuals' constitutional right to have an abortion, people freaked the fuck out because they realized that their rights were not enshrined, that their belief in what they deserved to be a constitutional right was not something that was represented by the very people who were supposed to protect it. The reason that this is important for the round is because when people feel unstable in the democracy that is meant to protect them, they protest and they don't feel that they have a voice in that democracy. Okay, the context in which this is most likely to occur then is when governments will most likely do this when there is massive political precedent, that is, massive protests and political uproar over a decision being made that they don't feel that the majority of people within this country feel does not represent them. The reason that this is important is because that means that that the Supreme Court doesn't lose all legitimacy just when something is done that is widely problematic to the majority of people. This looks generally like if in the US the simple majority would be in the Congress and the parliamentary system it would be in the parliament. Okay. The way that this debate then should be focused on is that the outcomes are probably symmetric. That is to say that on either side the decision is likely to be made, bad policies exist in either world. The decision is twofold. The decision is on who can best capture democratic opinion, and second, on people feeling confident in the legal structures that protect them. Two arguments then on those fronts. First, why are Supreme Courts and constitutional courts as a whole bad at capturing democratic opinion? The reason that this matters is because regardless of competency of the Supreme Court and its judges, if they don't abide by the needs of the people, then when those needs are not met, power needs to be reduced. This issue needs to in some way be resolved, right? Okay, 3 ways that this is, the reason that this is true, that they don't capture democratic opinion. First, they're highly, highly secluded from the average person. The privilege that got them there in the first place is likely to be situations where they're more likely to be from a majoritarian household, have gone to incredibly privileged schools, incredibly privileged backgrounds, etc. The comparative is individuals in the Congress or Parliament are more likely to permeate when they have lesser levels of privilege. That is, AOC can better access and more likely to access that space because they're being voted in by the very people they're representing, as opposed to the president of the US deciding who is going to be sitting in the Supreme Court. That comparative is incredibly important. Second, they aren't truly accountable to anyone once they are in the Supreme Court. That is to say, first of all, they stay there for their entire lives. They know that their position is secure. That means that they don't have any, they can be questioned by the society that is, that they're deciding for, but it doesn't truly matter. It doesn't have an impact on the decisions that they have to make. There are 2 options they have. Either they stick by racist law that has been produced 100 years ago, or they insert their own opinion. Both are really shit. The impact is that either way, they're making bad decisions that aren't representative of the people. That is incredibly bad, and we do not vote for that. Third, in an increased populist world, they have become more politically biased. The reason that this is important is because the uniqueness of the Supreme Court used to be that they were devoid of politics, that they were apolitical, and therefore could represent the law the best. The issue is, the status quo now, is that they are either staunchly conservative judges that are voted in, or decided in, or staunchly liberal judges that are voted in. And either way, this is incredibly problematic. because it means that politics is a necessary part of the Supreme Court now. That means that the way in which they were just supposed to abide by the extreme letter of the law is less likely to exist, and is therefore not something that should be the deciding factor of this debate. No, I'll go with it. Okay. Second, then, on why politicians are better at capturing public opinion. Again, the reason that this is important is because in a democracy, the way that it stays stable and functions best is if people believe that their voices are being heard. So, we agree that there are elections incentives and lobbyists that exist in the politicians that might also become incentives for them. But we will give you incentives that are independent of that, and that even in the presence of these variables, they are still better and still more better at capturing the public opinion than the very individuals who are completely separate from it. So, 3 points on this then. First, they just interact with the people on the ground significantly more, to a much greater extent. That is to say that in the best case, they are building empathy because they are on the ground, they're discussing with the very people who they're representing, asking them what they need in their policies, what they want, what the specific issues that they're experiencing right now. But in the worst case, they still have to answer to those people. They still do go on the ground, even if they don't build the empathy and see what those individuals' lives are like. Those people still get to have a conversation with them and be like, hey, I really don't think that you've met my policy. I voted for you before. I'm not going to vote for you again unless you change. They hear this, and they have to make the deciding factor on whether that's enough for them to change their approach in politics. Before I go on closing.
So if you so believe in the whims of democratic will in the electoral cycle, do you believe judiciary should be abolished?
Look, I've already told you that the metric of deciding this debate is on the ability of individuals to feel that they're represented. I've already told you that the Supreme Court's legitimacy is not going to be cut down entirely. Let me move on. Second, they're reliant on people's perceptions. This goes into the second point. But even if that person is shit, even if the politician is shit, people still need to feel confident in the legislation that they have decided on in order to vote for them again. That means that they necessarily must represent the people. Third, they can be easily countered. That is to say that competition necessarily moderates them. They must live by compromise. This is to say that they are not likely to do something super extreme with the decision to overturn a Supreme Court decision. Instead, they are likely to have a conversation with the moderates. They don't want to have it overturned in an election cycle because that fucks over their politician, their campaign in the future to say that they were successful. This is to say that in a world where people don't have access to their democratic opinion, or they feel that they don't have access to their democratic opinion being represented, they, one, lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to represent them. This is incredibly likely to increase under their world. But two, they are more likely to become extreme, because if you don't trust that the institutions will represent you, then you go and find other places where you can access the rights you believe are so inherently intrinsic to you. The impact is, this debate is not about outcomes. It is about capturing democratic opinion, making sure that people feel heard. Very proud to propose.
We'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now let the Leader of the Opposition to begin the off-case in this debate. Hear, hear.
My speech in 3, 2, 1. The battle cry coming from HUJI is they want to pass progressive policies, but the question is oftentimes how. I don't understand how the incentives of politicians will be good coming from their side, but even if these incentives are good, it is speculative whether or not we actually have someone benevolent in power. But what we have on the side of open opposition is the assurance that regardless of who is in power, regardless of what political party is dominant right now, we are ensured that the government works because it is rigid and it is sure in what it is, and we are sure that even if it is not good, we have faith that there is a potential to get better. They even say that these policies are so good, they're so popular, but somehow they don't have enough to get the supermajority of 66%. Can we even believe open government that this is really what the people want? Obviously, the outcomes are not symmetric when it is their side that has the flippant structures, but also their side that probably has policies that are not solvent for the future at the end of the day. The first thing I want to do is just some quick setup. So obviously we stand for something. The alternative on our side is we have a supermajority, that is 66% or 2/3. The Constitution is meant to do two things. The first is protect the most fundamental rights of people, that is, the rights themselves to just which the government wants to begin with, such as
Clarification.
party terms, limits, sit. These are things that you fundamentally have the capacity to change so easily on their side. But more importantly, is the capacity for the Constitution to protect democracy that is absolutely compromised because the legislature can just agree with whatever the precedent is because Congress says so, right? These are so consequential already from the very get-go. That makes it so we ought to err on the side of caution by making it the 66%, but also we want to have a certainty that it is really what society wants, not have flippant policies at the end of the day. There are two things I'm going to run. The first is why the 51% is just insufficient and ridiculous, and the second is why you will have far more democratic backsliding on the side of government. First argument, why is this 51% insufficient? There are three structural reasons. The first is, there are often temporal anomalies that make people act irrationally at the point in time that they want things to change, right? Things like recession, attacks of terrorism, or even calamities that oftentimes skew the ways in which people think that make them only prefer the short term, right? These are cause things like large social anger, but also oftentimes people are looking for someone to blame as a result of this, which is why oftentimes they choose to blame people who have no voice or no capacity to fight back, like minorities who are likely to be disenfranchised by these policies at the end of the day. The second reason is, I also think there are differences in political capture that make it so that people can harness this power perniciously. So they acknowledge there are differences, but it's there that actually allows people to hold these differences to be far worse. That is to say, majority groups are likely to do things like delay discussion until they get congestion, gerrymandering, or voter suppression that makes it so that they're the ones who will always be followed, especially because the bar and the threshold to move forward is so little at the simple majority. The last thing is, I think oftentimes there's just a time where there's a matter of luck in terms of who is in government. There are instances in which people just are unable to go out and vote because perhaps they have to work that day, or perhaps their rainy seasons or calamities prevent them from being able to go out into the motorways, that make it so sometimes the government itself is not even representative. There are three important implications from this. The first is, 51% of votes does not mean you actually represent the populace on the ground. The second is, even if you do represent what people want, it is often the most irrational desires which we ought not oppose, especially with these forms of changes, because these are changes are extremely crucial to the actual functions of how society works to begin with. The third is, I also think that the section of people you exclude far more are those from the most vulnerable sectors, which is why we ought to abhor whatever government is standing for. It is unclear if this is the democratic will of people, but it is clear that on government, even if you do represent people, it is probably going to be those from the majority already, probably who are represented to begin with, and therefore the change is non-existent on their side. The first argument is already absolutely demolishing to whatever government is going to run. Second, why this results in greater democratic backsliding? Before I'm on, Eli.
Yeah, when opening opposition wants to counter-prop, they need to do something that is mutually exclusive with the motion. What you are suggesting is not mutually exclusive with the motion, and so cannot be a counter.
No. It's what happened in the status quo. I don't think that's a true thing. Anyway, moving on. Next, why this leads to democratic backsliding. The thing is, I think at the point in time you do this policy, the problem is you can never go back at the point in time you allow for this to happen. There are three reasons. The first is, during times of crisis, oftentimes authoritarian regimes use to centralize their power. It's far difficult to get back. At the point in time you do things like change term limits, change the way we respect voter suppression, etc., or the control over the military and things like diversity quota. Even if there are free and fair elections, the majority group often has the incentive to make sure that they will never lose at the end of the day, which makes it so you lose a lot of the checks and balances we currently have in status quo. The second thing is, even if it is not the corrupt party who is going to win, liberal groups would also act in the same manner due to the mindset that I am the good guy, and therefore I ought to uphold these changes to ensure I stay because I am the ones with the proper policies that are actually going to get these things on track, even if they go against the entire spirit of what democracy ought to be to begin with, right? The third thing is, I also think that it also makes the internal processes within politics far worse. At the point in time you discourage things like negotiations and horse trading. You have no incentive to form coalitions, no incentive to unify or be not polarizing because the threshold to you being able to pass your policies is far easier. You can likely concentrate on your own base for the legislative and the constitutional areas because of the only simple majority, which is oftentimes worse off for minorities who rely on forming coalitions with the majority groups and horse trading to be able to actually get the things that they want. There is no incentive to listen to these individuals on their side when the majority can just centralize their power among themselves, and politics becomes far more exclusionary as proliferated by these majority groups. Regardless of politicization, or regardless of who is going to be in power, the behavior of both sides is going to be generally far worse. Why then is the comparative much better? The first thing is, we limit the power to change the actual structures within society. That makes it so our government is far more solid in the future. The second thing is, the safety of the democracy. That makes it so, even if at the point when we do that change, we are certain this is what the people want. We are certain this is something that looks like we would be good, etc., etc. Even if we had to adjust how we get progressive policies, I actually think that why we don't have these policies is the temporal delays. And if they acknowledge that people do like these policies and in a liberalizing world, that means there's high incentive that makes it so we can get these things in the future. I don't understand the immediacy, especially if it comes at the cost of going through the actual process. The second thing is, the change is just net neutral, right? We're not sure that if we can arbitrate whether these policies are good or not, but the process is on your side, and changing institutions is far worse, and it also brings a question to the legitimacy of whether or not these are things that are good or bad to begin with. If you have such a low threshold, people off the ground can say, oh, I don't actually respect this decision, or at the very worst case, if the changes and wills of people change so frequently, it makes it so that the state is so flippant that there is no stability in that sense, right? The point is, and I think why this matters is because number one, regardless of who is in power, we want to make sure that the state works. We want to make sure that even if it's a bad person in power, there are still ways we can take them out of power when there are no term limits. But secondly, we also need to take into account interests of future generations and ensure that our state will also be able to cater to whatever they want as opposed to the flimsy wills of people right now. For all of these reasons, oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech, and now the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case. Hear, hear.
Here is the series of things OO concedes. The Supreme Courts are truly bad in capturing democratic opinion and need to be checked. They also agree that politicians are way better in capturing democratic opinion and thus should be the structure that checks back the Supreme Courts and the Constitutional Court. What these two concessions essentially do to them is their marginal benefit that you must vote on is whether or not it needs to be simple majority or two-thirds majority. Here's why that's a little fucked. It's because they're broadly conceding the fact that the legitimacy of Supreme Courts under their world is radically low. They're also literally conceding that politicians who are the same agents that they rely upon under their world in order to be rational in the two-third majority world in which they live in are actually the actors that can properly make sure that people follow legislature. Which means more than half of our case is unengaged true, and all that I have to rebut at a partial double octave finals is whether or not it should be two-thirds or simple. Easy rebuttal for me, I guess. So I'll do that first, and then I'll tell you the impacts, and I'll take the debate back to what it should be as to whether or not government should be allowed to do this in the first place, because in status quo, government aren't allowed to just overturn. They're allowed to appeal in some cases, but they're not allowed to overturn, Supreme Courts, choosing to, overturn Roe v. Wade. All right. First, in terms of why majorities are apparently bad under their world. And their analysis here is there are temporal anomalies, there's voter suppression, yada yada yada. No, panel, we're not saying that we're holding a referendum. We're in a moment of hysteria, we're asking people to vote on their opinion. Which means that we're not capitalizing on hysteria of individuals and making them vote simple majority. We're asking politicians to do this. Politicians have an incentive inbuilt in them to not engage in hysterical reactions of individuals. One, because it takes a lot of political capital and a lot of time for them to do this, which means they have to likely sacrifice other policy measures that they're undertaking to cater to the hysteria. If all recognizes this hysteria, the politician who has its constituency, they also probably realize that it's hysteria, so they try to mitigate it as much as possible to make sure that these concessions don't go by. But second, Kayla already gave you analysis as to why there's competition. Which means that, if there's Republican hysteria about COVID, Democrats don't sit and go let Republicans ride on that hysteria. They counter-check. The reason why this counter-check is often sufficient is because in Congress or in Senate, where the seats are quite the margins are quite small, these small margins often allow for politicians to go across the aisle and ask other politicians to either A, make a compromise, or C, give greater evidence as to why things need to essentially change. Which means that hysteria, given that it's temporal by nature, can be ridden off in a world in which you have politicians who, like, again, have to compete with each other in order to win. Which means, panel, their major concerns about majorities being screwed is, I just think, null insofar as politicians' incentives exist to not ride hysteria. But even if you think that majorities are, too small for whatever reason, I would like you to ask yourself a question. What mechanism have they given you to tell you why just increasing it by 20% massively makes a difference? Because the nature of hysteria is as such. It is widespread and it is speculative in nature, right? It's speculative in nature because you assume that people are going to be paranoid about things because you see that, 10,000 people are paranoid about things. Insofar as this is true, and if politicians are that bad at doing their job, it is likely that even under their world, politicians who base their decisions on hysteria and temporal preferences of people likely will make the speculative decisions of meeting that 2/3 majority in an irrational way as well. All of these reasons say, panel, their mechanistic quibble of, should it be majority or 2/3, I think is bad. Second, they talk about democratic backsliding and why it harms minorities coalition building. Look, panel, it is easier for right-wing blocs under their world to block progressive policies because, again, they under our world they need to counter a majority. Under their world, you just need to get 30%, which means that under their world, you need to accumulate a smaller amount of Republicans to say no to, let's say, abortion in order to stop abortion from being overturned. Which means I just don't understand. Here's the thing. When you make the margins of dissent smaller, which they do, they make the margin of dissent 37% or whatnot, or whatever the fuck that is, it's easier for right-wing individuals to create blocks. When it's simple majority, it is easy. It is harder because simple majority requires you to accumulate Republicans of 40, 45%, or even more to say that Roe v. Wade shouldn't be overturned. All of this is to say, panel, I don't think they win this debate on those two arguments alone. Before I move on, CEO, who has to follow this model, go.
Yeah, if generally courts are seen as politically biased and undemocratic in general, wouldn't it be the reason why democratic governments are going to antagonize these courts and then abuse this system?
I think they antagonize these courts and abuse the system under your world more. Here are the three impacts from Kayla's case that about why, if you let people feel like they don't have a say, it's bad. One, you're more likely to get protests and violence under their world because people don't feel like they have any other avenue to change. Because under their world, again, if CEO's world is we don't let governments do this, period, that means that you're likely to get protests and violence. Second, you're more likely to get people voting in more populist leaders. The reason why this is true is because, look, it's great that gay marriage was passed in 2013, but it laid a seed for people to be wildly unhappy and vote in populist leaders like Trump, because essentially what they felt that their preferences as the U.S. commune was not being considered. The reason why that's bad is because people like Trump vote in people like Kavanaugh, and when they vote in people like Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court becomes more and more populist, which is one of the mechanisms that Kayla gave you. What is the way, and why does everything come downstream of this? The simple reason is, panel, this. The moment in time you don't allow people to A, capture their democratic opinion and voice their concern, they either take to the streets or vote in more extreme leaders to stop your progressive policies. Insofar as we prove that, give OG the ballot. Thanks.
We'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now with the DLO to close off the top half. Hear, hear!
Alright, can everybody hear me? Alright, what's up? You ready? Okay. My speech in 3, 2, 1. On government, they like to pretend that there's no difference between a simple majority and an absolute majority. But then again, on government, they're operating on the difference of what could potentially be one vote. One vote to decide the presidential term limit being 3 years or 100 years. One vote to decide whether or not they can ban opposition parties, ban communist parties, and control the media. They say that we live a highly polarized world, but they functionally do not suggest why 51% is a tipping point, but rather whether or not we should be actually representative of the majority at large. In my speech, I will do 5 things. First of all, I'll clarify the model and the difference between the super and the simple majority. Second of all, I'll explain to you why this will be used a lot in the Luther initially. Third of all, I'll do a case analysis to success, specifically in the countries with weak institutions. This is terrible. Fourth of all, I'll talk about comparative elitism. And fifth of all, I'll talk about the propensity of harms. First of all, clarification. Why is this something that's just for opposition to defend? So the first thing to suggest is simply, this is the model in status quo and in almost every single democracy. In the United States, they have supermajorities to reform and change the constitution, but what functionally changes is you need to have certainty and have the majority of people backing you. Examples such as the suffrage movement or the emancipation of the vast majority of people suggest that there's a functional difference. The second of all, what is the practical difference? The difference between the 51% majority and the 66% majority is, as I've highlighted before, massive because it suggests the burden is not on a single person, not on a single constitution, or not on a single constituent, which suggests that you have to convince large parties, or at least a large demographic of people, to make sure that there's a degree of change. The second thing, if by their own analysis we live in a polarized world, it is very difficult for most people to get a 51 or 66% majority because there's a roughly even split. It is only in instances which they suggest where there's massive popular support would we ever actually reach somebody to hit a supermajority. The third thing is there's a conceptual difference. If it is considered a supermajority and a large taboo for it to change, even if functionally a lot of politicians could get the 66%, it happens significantly less likely because it's seen as a cultural taboo and it happens less often. The impact of this is to suggest simply, it is actually on up, where you actually use this policy very sparingly and only in the instances where it's immensely popular, and it's gov where you use it very perniciously. Second of all, why is it likely that it's going to be used a lot? They only highlight the good reasons in which you would want to reform the Constitution. On top, if you were a power-hungry person in power, if you're a cult of personality, such as Modi, such as Bolsonaro, etc., you have massive funds to gain from reforming the Constitution. Whether it be your power to run forever, your power to suppress the media, the power to make sure that you're consistently wealthy, and the checks on your own corruption is not stopped, is significantly more important to you because this is how you stay in power forever, this is how you live luxuriously, and therefore if you have the capacity to do it, you will do it, especially as the checks and balances to stop you would not happen. This ultimately suggests that maybe they have some good things on government side, but the large propensity of damage you could do to a democracy, you could do to an electoral cycle, now and forever, suggests that even if they were equally likely, it's terrible for God. The third thing I would like to suggest is talking about strong institutions and your propensity to stop them. They say on government, in many democracies such as the United States, there are very popular people that would likely arise to make sure that there's some democratic dissent to make sure that these things doesn't happen. But the reality is, in the mentally of the developing world, the institutions that protect the Supreme Court or even democratic rights aren't so established. Many people even question whether or not they're legitimate, which is ultimately to suggest it is specifically in these countries where it will not only be significantly more palatable to challenge these institutions, but secondly, it will often be significantly popular, in which they suggest this is where we can get stability, this is when we can ensure continuous economic growth if I don't have to deal with all of these problematic checks and balances to my power. This is ultimately to suggest that even in their best case where they have some democracies that are already doing well, get comparatively better off, and the ones that are still nascent and developing, where people don't value these institutions, they will be destroyed and ultimately there will be no coming back. First of all, let's talk about comparative elitism. They come here in government and they say that the Supreme Court is privileged, they go to Ivy League schools and that's bad. Comparatively, congressmen and members of Senate are also elitist. But we would suggest they're elitist in functionally different ways. Whether it is name recognition, you have a name like Bush, you have a name like Clinton, whether it is wealth, the political connections and ties that you have to your community, these are things that are significantly worse. Primarily because they're immutable, they're inherited, they have nothing to do with your practical capability. Yes, you do have to be very wealthy to enter Ivy League school, but you also have to be very smart to enter Ivy League school. Be appointed by the bar and suggest, here are the potential lists of candidates to which you could appoint to the same court, even though might select from an ultimately elite group of individuals. At the very least, on opposition side, we could guarantee that there's a fundamental respect for things like the institution of the court, or at the very least, a bare minimum of competency. Comparatively, while the degree of elitism might exist, there's no guarantee that they care about the courts. There's no guarantee that they care about the institutions. And moreover, the difference is bypassed. That is to suggest, If you entered the law, you could probably have made significantly more money if you entered into corporate law or any other degree of lucrative fields, but comparatively, if you entered the law and would be into the Supreme Court, at the very least you would like to care about that democracy. Which is to suggest, even if you argue that to an extent they would be conservative, the types of conservative policies that we support might be things like gender bias, but would also be things like ensuring the democracy and making sure that presidential term limits don't be bypassed in the same way that they haven't been done to other countries. Which is ultimately to suggest that most might argue elitism, but the types of elitism are significantly preferable to the democracy. Before I move on, I'd like to take P1.
On which side do you think there is a far greater incentive to make the courts actively worse?
Yours, because to the extent that these courts ultimately act as a rubber stamp and can ultimately perpetuate the government's policy, it makes it so that you can make them worse and worse without any consequences. It is specifically on opposition, where there's a greater degree of gravitas, where individual parties don't want to stack the court because they fear that ultimately the court might work against them, where they're ultimately the most fair and they pass policies to make sure that the other party can't take advantage of that. Specifically, it is these checks and balances that we protect in opposition that they allow to be overturned with a simple change of policy on government. Finally, let's talk about the comparative and why we at least don't go backwards. So I would suggest that, even if you believe that there could be more bad things that happen on the opposition side, at the very least we suggest that those bad things get resolved over time. Listen to analysis of government. If their analysis is over time, people get more educated, people get more liberal, and thus the policies and the time delay make it so that they ultimately outstrip the court, all of those problems would eventually be overlaid. Over time, people would get to that 66 majority and they would legalize things like gay marriage. Ultimately, it is the massive propensity of risk that we present on top, wherein one day you could strive in the courts, wherein one day you could control the media, which stops this natural trend towards liberalism that they outline on the government side that would ultimately save democracy. Which is to suggest, even if everything is correct on the opposition side, that we actually institute worse policies because the court is naturally elitist, at least we prevent that 0.5% of instances where the court can actively undermine democracy and stop this natural trend towards liberalism. Ultimately, what we provide for all. Number one, we highlight the massive amount of risk and need to protect the Constitution. And two, even if there is some marginal benefits, we won't achieve those things in gov, and it's much better that we err on the side of caution. That I'm proud to oppose.
We'd like to thank the PLO for that fine speech. Could everyone on top have what's a great debate? We now have a member of government to open the closing half of this debate. Hear, hear. People have put a chair on the table before another round. Should be fine.
Otherwise, I will not be able to see my notes. Nope, that ain't gonna work. Fine. No, it's fine, don't worry about
Do
it.
you want a pot plant?
I always want to talk. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to start with one reality check. I'm also going to go on the clash that opening have talked about a ton, but notice most of what Supreme Courts do, or courts in general do, is not constitutional changes. The vast majority of the time, what courts are dealing with is sending people to jail, paying damages. Is this person who didn't hire someone because they're black supposed to pay? How much do they pay? Where do they pay? Is this something that we even believe is wrong or right? And has nothing to do with the constitutional change that we've heard. Notice, we think on our side, we have far more interest to appoint conservative judges or an attempt to undermine these kinds of political systems. And what this ends up leading to is just the day-to-day life of people who have to deal with the court system, the legal system, is far worse for them. This looks like more blacks being incarcerated in the US. This looks like them not being hired, and that's totally fine. And when you go and you sue for this, your damages the other person ends up getting is basically nothing. It's like $1, the minimum amount supposed to be given by law. These are all the interpretations, which is the vast majority of what the legal stuff does, is in the worst possible way for these things. Why is this necessary? Because in order to ever affect the Supreme Court, you have to appoint lower court judges. And those lower court judges, even if they never make it to the Supreme Court, still pass laws, still affect the legal system in many, many different ways. So even if their POI is, but this is only about the Supreme Court, notice you have to appoint a ton of judges before any of the judges you appoint ever get to the Supreme Court. So the vast majority of the judges that we're going to be talking about are not the Supreme Court judges, and this is the #1 impact in this debate. I'm going to do one other major thing in this speech, because I'm going to explain why we have far worse legislation and social change on our side. Before that, just one point of rebuttal. We hear a ton on side opposition of, oh my god, we're going to lose the democratic system, blah, blah, blah. Seriously, let's reality check this 1 second. it's probably unlikely that you get to overthrow the democratic system, and that for that to be cool. I think it is legitimate and probably a very unfair interpretation on their side. That's something that they get to do. Secondly, I also think that the public protection, public opinion, especially in democratic states, probably normally protects democratic institutions. Meaning, if you try to say, oh, I now get elected forever, that's very unlikely. Secondly, I also think that the comparative is people don't campaign on ours. They say, but if we get more people campaigning, let's give two structural reasons why that is the case. One, because campaigning is a lot of personal effort, and when I see that I'm getting the thing I'm getting right now, I don't see any reason to do that. It looks like I have to go out and protest. I have to actually call up my MP so that he knows what I think. I need to vote very strongly. I need to open Facebook groups. All these things take a lot of time from people, which normally they just can't be bothered to do, because on average, most people in this room haven't even voted. Secondly, I also think that in general, it just means that the need is very unclear to me on a salient level. When I don't feel like I'm not protected, when I don't see this happening, and I don't know a friend who couldn't get an abortion, I just don't see this as something that is a very widespread problem in the world, and I'm not worried about this being taken away. Great. Okay, let's explain why we think we have much less legislation on our side. So they say, listen, on our side of the house we have slow but steady incremental change, which is great. Listen, a world in which it takes 100 years of people never getting abortions, they can then and then they get them. And then that can be overturned by one crisis in which conservatives take power, get 60%, 66% of the vote, and then we go back, is not a very good world, right? That's a world where people suffer for a huge amount of time, and we're not really clear that they ever proved a large enough impact to justify this. Let's understand why we think this is actually the case. One, we think that current constitutions often suck because they represent old moral code. They represent ideas that weren't very good in the past. Secondly, the people who actually wrote these constitutions were often elites who didn't represent and weren't accountable to future ideas, which means the amount of change, the kinds of changes they were taking into account, they didn't care about what was going to happen. Secondly, we think we get far worse laws on their side. One, we create situations where temporary crisis, like what they're talking about, allows for long-term change, right? Why? Because these kinds of crises that they're talking about allow for specific people to take power, right? Like conservative individuals then take power, and they can lead to the kind of change that we're talking about. Secondly, it's also just incredibly hard to actually go up against elites. Why is this the case? One, the money they have to affect media is far, far greater, which means it's much easier for them to reach a core kind of a core public, which the other side will never be able to convince. An example of this is rural Republicans, right? All you need to do is have a media power that can actually just convince a very small number of people, and then you will never be able to create any kind of social change. Secondly, their ability to lobby politicians is far, far greater. They have much more access. They see them at meals and events. They literally have their phone number, and they don't have to try to go through aid and things like that. Finally, often the politicians themselves come from these elites, and thus, when their families say things, these are the people who they're going against, when they're hurting these people, they're going against their family and the people that they know, which means that it's much more difficult for them to overcome. Great. Why do we think that what we're talking about leads to far more court capture? One, it's just often the easiest place to go, right? Your chances of consistently winning an election is very, very unlikely. But your ability, once you've changed one Supreme Court justice, to make that from 3 to your side to 4 to your side, and then you're going to consistently win and be able to achieve the changes that you want over and over again, is far, far greater. It doesn't matter what the general majority want if you've got the Supreme Court on your side, on their side of the House. On our side of the House, you have to play on a much more even playing field, and normally conservatives do not have the majority of the vote. Example is the US, the example is England, etc., etc. Yes?
I mean, we also resolve this on our range. The elite on the right side is significantly more likely to be susceptible as opposed to a judge who would have to argue to.
I think that I've just given 3 reasons why what you're saying is not the case, but also you're assuming that you cannot appoint judges who are not susceptible to minorities and who are not accountable. But but what I'm showing right now is not why. Once we've done that, I'm showing why this creates the system that we're seeing today in every single country where this is the case, where the actual appointment of judges have become a completely political game in order to achieve, basically, you will never be able to make, almost never be able to make these changes. Secondly, I also think that oftentimes the court is where it's much, much easier to make this change, right? You can look at these, when you're looking at this person, you know how they voted, what kind of school they went to, what kind of other words for the thing that they passed, like their rulings were. And what this then means is you have a very good idea that the person you're actually appointing is going to do what you think he's going to do, and the amount of power that this person then has in order to advance your agenda is far, far greater. What this means is it's much more worth your while than to invest in a politician, because politicians will change with the winds, right? Their local electorate decide that they want to become more liberal, they're probably going to become more liberal. Their local electorate decide that they want to invest, that it's really important for them to invest in this kind of infrastructure, they'll probably start investing in this infrastructure. We see this with Joe Manchin, who might be a Democrat, but he doesn't actually allow other Democrats to do what they want because he is so accountable to his local electorate. So what we get on our side is a much more worse system. Please propose.
We'd like to thank the Member of Government for that fine speech and the PDO to give the CO case to this debate. Hear, hear.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mainly two things come from me. Firstly, why the political volatility and the lack of continuity that's created on their side is bad. Irregardless of whether you believe these policies are going to be progressive or regressive, the fact that they're going to be volatile in and of itself prevents democracy from being able to achieve things for people. Secondly, why we think you're going to get, not going to get constitutional amendments, or will weigh up this is why this better. Just really want to frame out opening options case of how you get democratic backsliding. I think this is just marginal in this debate. Number one, because these people probably have enough power to do things like media control, voter suppression that probably gets them 60%, 66% anyway. Because the margin that they're debating on is 50% to 66%. It's severely unlikely why these political parties can't get this. But secondly, many of these institutions are corrupt anyway in many of these developing states. It's severely unclear why you're going to get massive independence of these judicial people to be able to get this kind of check and balance. I don't think they prove any mechanism as to why this is feasible in the first place. Firstly, let's talk about political volatility and why this is going to actively be worse, even if you don't believe that this is going to be aggressive or progressive. It's just either way, it's going to be really bad. Basically, what happens is that parties have far more incentive to do things like claim radical policies, do things like polarization within this field in the first place. This looks like doing things like an absolute Muslim ban instead of like restrictions on gun rights, for example, or a massive absolute gun law ban instead of doing things like restriction on these people, but doing like complete abortion ban, etc. in these places, right? Which is likely to happen on their side far more, when you know that you can pass this, even if it's like, for example, some unconstitutional or unlawful, and you're going to get this, at the point at which you get a 50% majority, it's going to always pass in these instances. On the comparative, you do not have incentive to do things like pass radical policies that go against the Constitution, or is likely to be overturned in this court for several reasons. Obviously, firstly, if you cannot pass the legislation, you cannot cater to your demographic interests of your people, and therefore you might get voted out, and that becomes an additional incentive for you to make moderate policies that aren't likely to overturned in the judicial process, etc. Right? Secondarily, the fact that you are overturning the judicial court, as happened in Madrid, for example, you're back to be seen as a bad politician that does not have actual policies that cater to the people, or have policies that are constitutional. And for that in itself gives an incentive for these politicians to somehow have a race to the media, to have not have as radical policies, etc. in the first place, right? The incentive on their changes, and therefore you're likely to do things that create massively radical policies, etc. Right? That is the state of polarization that happens in many of these states in the first place, right? Therefore, on their side, you get more radical policies in general. I think this is bad in and of itself. The fact that you get more radical policies is that many times it means that it caters far less to the 49% of the people that did not get voted in. This looks like radical policies that harm the most vulnerable, for example, are likely to get things like this in the first place, right? But secondly, I think this massively reduces the efficacy of the government to do anything in the first place. So I just want to note that even if you don't buy these are going to be massively radical policies, the fact that there's a lack of continuity within these policies on their side, because it does not adhere to one law or the Constitution, in and of itself is must be like that. This, for example, looks like when the Democrats are in power, you have abortion that is legalized, and then if the Republicans go in power, you get abortion that is banned, for example. I would say this, in and of itself, is likely to be really, really bad in the first place. The first reason why this is bad is because many of these politicians are unlikely to have any incentive to do things like implement long-term policies in general. The fact that they can be overturned in the next election when a government comes in and overthrows you basically means that they do not have incentive to implement these long-term policies that actually help people on the ground to begin with, right? But secondly, the fact that you have consistently changing policies massively reduces the efficiency of these policies in general. The fact that you can't have infrastructure set up to continue into the next slide. But for example, if you have things like, sub-centers set up that continue into the next slide, you have to cash all that when the policy changes, or when the incumbent party changes, which is massively likely when you don't have the continuity of the law on their side, is when all this goes to trash, you waste massive amounts of resources, and you do not actually get anything done for the people on the ground. That is why, irregardless of whether you believe these policies are going to be good or bad,
bad, the fact that you can't have continuity in policies in and of itself harms the people on the ground, irregardless what these policies necessarily look like in the first place. But obviously this means you lose massive amounts of money, for example, just a bad resource allocation in general, that is just like a waste of money. I think that is obviously bad in this debate. But fourthly, the fact that you do not actually get things that are passed that actually help people on the ground reduces buy-in to democracy, therefore making people less likely to vote, for example, less likely to go on the streets and to protest for their democracy rights. And this in and of itself is also bad when you do not have democratic buy-in that actually captivates the people's demographics on the ground. That's when you have political apathy that happens on their side.
Yeah, so under your world, so when Trump banned Muslims to enter the country, the Supreme Court overturned them. But under your world, when the Supreme Court says no to abortions, Democrats can't do anything. We are the one who's like canceling out the extremities from the legislative side of the government.
Obviously, that your example falls for our side. The fact that the Muslim ban didn't happen is great, even if it can be true on both sides. So, like your case, examples are bad in this debate because it exists for both sides. What we're saying is that continuity in and of itself is important, and the fact that they said both examples already points to the fact that the only constant in this debate is our case on continuity. Secondly, let's talk about why constitutional amendments that are likely to happen uniquely on our side is good. I would say firstly that I think politicians and political parties in general lose the incentive to do things like constitutional amendments on their side. Firstly, obviously, there's like a lot of different hurdles that they have to overcome to do things like constitutional amendments, whether it be getting a supermajority, having to coalesce with other parties, etc. They do not have the incentive to overcome this kind of hurdles on their side when they know that they can just pass whatever they want even without doing this constitutional amendment on their side, right? But obviously on our side, you do still have the incentive when there's enough people in your voter bloc that obviously cares about these things. That is when they have the incentive to go ahead and do things like constitutional amendments, enshrine, abortion in the law, for example, that Democrats are trying to do right now. I think this incentive massively decreases on their side when they don't have to do that to ensure anything. Then obviously there's lots of different reasons why that would be unstrategic for them when they can push other policies on their side. This is really bad because constitutional amendment is far greater and better than their fluffy incentive of maybe being able to overturn it in some instances and some not. Because firstly, obviously again, creating these constitutional amendments require you to make things like coalitions with other parties that increases the amount of demographics that are represented within this process in and of itself in the first place. But secondly, the fact that it is a constant makes sure that people have these rights in the long term, for example. And the reason that Roe v. Wade was overturned was because it wasn't enshrined in the Constitution, and you never actually changed those things to begin with. When we have the incentive political parties to do this, that is when you ensure these rights in the long term, and therefore that is a better way for people to be able to get things on the ground. But thirdly, the process that happens between this allows people to be more informed about this. The fact that, for example, the Constitution is seen as sacred, for example, incentivizes people like media companies or politicians to explain the process to the people on the ground and get people to buy into these things because they want to pass the supermajority, etc. Right? That is when people have the information to make decisions for themselves, have the incentive to make things what the Constitution should look like for their country, for example. And that process of discourse allows people to have the information to be able to understand what these policies are and have people opting into democracy as a whole. First, right? So firstly, even if you don't believe that these policies are going to be good or bad, because obviously it can happen on either case, considering the fact that there's some conservative judges and some progressive judges, the fact that it is a constant and a continuity is the only reason why you should care about this debate to begin with. But obviously things like constitutional amendments that enshrine this in the law protect these people's rights better, and that is why we clearly take this debate.
We'd like to thank the ML for that fine speech. Now invite the government whip to close out the government side of this debate. You're here.
Sorry, just a sec. I forgot that all my pages are on top of each other, but that won't work. Okay, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 3 major clashes within this debate. The first is where do we get better legislation and just the laws of the land better reflective of what people want, but also just less likely to be actively harmful towards them on a permanent basis. Second, where the courts are better and their dealings with the public and their rulings are more likely to be fair and just and those that they need to be making and not affected by purely political incentives. And lastly, democratic backsliding, which I'm going to simply show is highly unlikely within this debate, very irrelevant, and they're already out on that. Let's first do some rebuttal and take CO out of the debate as well. Now, when we say, oh, but there's in this instance where basically they try to argue that the incentive to legislate extreme legislation and to polarize society and try to pass these sorts of extreme legislation is higher on our side. This is why this is extremely unlikely, because they show it themselves that this extreme legislation is something risky, it's something that the public isn't always going to want and that you need to be wary of. But on our side you have far less to lose by doing this, because you're not going to have to live with any of the consequences. You can simply, on their side you can do this a lot more. You don't have to live with consequences. You can signal to your voters, hey look, I tried to pass legislation that would make being black illegal in the country, but the Supreme Court blocked me, but I'm really on your side. I'm really trying to do what it is that you want. This is when you polarize and when you encourage this sort of thought, and when you create this incentive far more on their side, because you are not going to lose anything. The court is simply going to give you a very simple, easy excuse to avoid this. This also means that the risk in which, when you do this thinking the court is going to overrule you and it's going to be fine, but then they don't, that is when this legislation accidentally passes and you get so many worse things because you didn't calculate correctly and you didn't realize that this is something the court doesn't have the power of the constitutional right to block. Next on this thing of the changeability and the fact that governments aren't long-termists and they don't think about how these things are going to affect in the long term. We think this is precisely why, if your only way of getting what you want, of supplying your voters with what it is that they want, is by changing the constitution, because you can't overcome the court. There is no way for you to do this, and so what you're going to do is fight for that two-thirds majority, whatever the majority is in a particular nation, and change the constitution so that you can get what you want. That is the huge problem, because you're not going to do it with a long-termist thought of, is this an important change to the constitution? Is this something that we want to see happening? You're just doing it to achieve this singular point in time thing that you want. We would rather it be easy to achieve it, do it with a 51%, because you know what? Then it's easier to reverse back again. And that means that the change you create is just a lot less harmful, and that is what is important within the debate. Now, lastly on constitutional change as a whole. Note that even if the constitution is bad, we just want these changes to be well considered. And this is precisely the point. We don't want them done because of singular temporary incentives or because there is a lack of alternatives. And this is why even if we get less constitutional change on our side, we get better constitutional change on our side, and the constitution remains better than the alternative where it is more likely to be changed for bad reasons. Let's enter into the clashes of better legislation. I think that a lot of that way, and just what I just said about this, I've already explained now within my rebuttal. But note why we think that this is far more important than other things that we've heard within the debate. Because we think that, as has been explained, the Constitution has an enormous effect on many, many aspects of people's lives, and it's something that is critical to the way that the courts make many, many decisions, not only legislative decisions. At that point, we think that when the very temporary incentives of politicians pushes them to make these policies is very, very bad. Note, even if it's not always that we have a sufficient majority for radical policies and radical changes to the Constitution, if it's only rare instances where they choose to do this, the harm is enormous because it's going to be very, very hard to correct this in the future, and it's going to be very unlikely that there is any way of avoiding those harms, and it's going to be enshrined, and that is why we think that the overall harm over time to the entire public is so much greater. Next, let's go into this issue of where the courts are better, because we think that OG, to some extent, maybe say, oh yeah, you want to affect the courts, you want to put the people that you want in. But note that this is true to some extent on both sides. On both sides, the courts are something that you want to affect. But Isha comes and explains that this requires a lot of political capital, a lot of effort, a lot of your time, a lot of your resources. And all of these things, the difference in incentive makes a very big difference in how much you invest in affecting the courts. Now, if your power relative to the courts is greater than it used to be, you're going to invest more in making sure you have that 51% majority in order to just legislate over the court when it made a ruling, rather than investing all of your resources into changing the way the court operates. This engages with OO on where the courts are better, because when OO argue that, oh, but you want to affect the courts, but you want to affect the courts a lot more on your side, and you invest in affecting the courts on our side. And note that this is very important outside of legislature. As Yeshai points out, Supreme Courts receive vast numbers of appeals on everything, on suits, on the appeals of just things that were not normal court issues that were just, that they weren't happy with in the lower courts, and they went up and up and up. This is a huge extent of impact on the general public. It is unique to the courts because of their most critical function, and one that no other body within the character within the state serves, and it is irreversible. You can't appeal above the Supreme Court, but legislation and even constitutional legislation can eventually be changed, so these changes don't occur as critically. Before I continue, closing. Okay.
This whole will they change, won't they change highlights the importance of all, because it is the provisions regarding free speech and the protection of all these people that allow change to happen to begin with.
Okay, cool. So let's just explain why backsliding just does not happen. Okay, first, let's just note on checks and balances and these sort of things. Most of the things that we'll talk about, such as gerrymandering and other aspects of how their bodies try to enshrine their power to some extent within elections, aren't legislative. These are executive moves that are done by governors or presidents and things of that sort, and just are not affected within this context to such a great extent because the legislature doesn't affect it that much. The second, there's an active incentive not to benefit the person who is currently in power, because power is mostly changeable, and it's very unlikely that you're going to create enough change to cement yourself in power permanently. So what happened is, you made it easier to stay in power. Next time you lose power, it's going to be way harder for you to come back. And also the next actors, who now it's been legitimized to try and cement their power, are going to do more, and so their comparative advantage is going to be even greater, because they'll have more time to do it and more time to cement further. You don't know who is going to end up on top at the end. Similarly to their arguments about the courts, and you don't know who's going to manage to control the courts, so that on our side with the courts, you're going to manage to affect until that person dies, whereas with this democratic cementing of your power, maybe it's 2 election cycles that you manage to win instead of 1, but it's very likely that soon you're going to lose it. And lastly, there are just so many other systems that are checks and balances beyond the courts and that are critical checks and balances. The public's vote isn't totally lost. People have the power to protest and go out into the street, and as Isha explains, that happens a lot more on our side. There is the press that criticizes what the government is doing and points out these things. There are inherent limitations of cooperation. Please propose.
We'd like to thank the government for that fine speech, and now we're on to close off this debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Is this one good? Let's take a closing comment out of this debate. The main claim that they make is that there is no incentive for politicians and legislatures to capture the court system. The first thing I want to point out is that under our side of the house, especially in the functional democracy, both political parties, assuming the argument is true, have an incentive to capture courts. And if both parties are equally viable, have similar amount of resources, then Republicans are going to buy 50% of the judges, and then the Democratic Party is going to buy 50% of the rest of the judges, and therefore this is going to balance out eventually. The second thing I want to point out is that they assume appointment of judges and controlling judges is really easy to begin with. One, this is US dependent context, and two, even in the United States, appointment of Supreme Court justices are really, really difficult, right? It's heavily decided in the institutional mechanism, right? It rarely happens like in the presidency, like one time you may be able to nominate one person, but that's it, right? So the limitation of the capacity to be able to capture court is something that they don't recognize. The third thing to point out is obviously lower court justices are not probably the relevant context in the debate, and I would probably also claim that in fact it is much easier to be able to control politicians under their side of the house. The reason for this is that obviously because lower court judges obviously have to come from graduates from law schools, for instance. And that means that you have limited amount of pool of human resources that you have to sort of buy out, whereas any random person can become politicians. It's probably easier to control politicians. The next claim that they make is that courts are bad because it adheres to old moral code and constitution was written by elites in the past. I want to point out oftentimes courts do interpretation, right? Maybe constitution was written in a bad faith, but obviously, in US Constitution, for instance, the term man was obviously meant as male only, but gradually it was interpreted to extend over racial minority and women as well. The other piece of framing that I want to take down from closing government is the idea of, legislature is not the most important thing. Individual cases matter, like black man getting justice or whatever. Firstly, not many people go to justice to be able to, in the hope of getting all the way to the Supreme Court, because obviously you have to go to multiple different lower courts, you have to win multiple different times. But the second thing to point out is that why does democratic government and any party care about individual cases of black men getting jailed, for instance, right? I would claim that given that there are so many cases that Supreme Court is juggling between all the time, that means that you selectively choose which, cases to actually veto, and obviously the most relevant context is one that concerns legislature, therefore it is out of the debate. That's why closing government is definitively out of the debate. Let's talk about our extension. Our extension was a political party now have an incentive to move to more extreme, and the policy continuity is going to be lost. This looks like the Republican Party, because they're able to get away with passing unconstitutional laws, they're more likely to ban an abortion in its entirety, and then in the next term when Democrats wins, Democrats are now going to say, oh, we're going to legalize abortion in the whole country. The lack of continuity is really important, right? Even if some policies are bad and some policies are good, there would be no policy efficacy in policies if the government is going to constantly switch all the policies all the time, right? And that's something that they miss in this debate. Government's response to this claim is that extreme policies are risky, therefore political parties are going to moderate. No, two reasons why extreme policies are really preferable for political parties. One is that you can capture more certain block of voter base, i.e. that when you tailor to the more extreme people, given that not every individual and not every moderate person, an average person, actually goes to vote in ballot box all the way, I think it's much certain that if abortion activists for instance, and if you say we're going to legalize abortion in all countries, obviously these people are going to most certainly go to vote. So that certainty is really important. The second thing to point out is obviously it's easier to show the differences to other political parties and antagonize other political parties as being anti-American, for instance, in the instance where you actually pass radical policies. So obviously extreme policies happen far more under their side of the house when there is no institutional control and institutional sort of limitation to how much you can do. By contrast, on the other side, given that constitution exists, parties cannot pass clearly anti-constitutional policies to begin with, right? And they say, well, parties are going to advocate for anti-constitutional things all the time. But I want to point out, obviously, you as a party need to get things done, right? In order to convince the electorate, you have to say, I got this policy passed. And that's why it's so important that you're now able to get away with passing anti-constitutional policy, and that's still being implemented all around the United States. To say, well, I ban abortion, right? And that's something that's incredibly important. The lack of continuity is the reason why there would be no policy efficacy, even the bad ones and the good ones, and that's the fundamental reason I think we win the debate automatically. Let's talk about opening government. I think the main claim that opening government makes is a democracy, right? The first thing on the tackle is the premise of their case is that the electoral result and democratic will that manifesting electoral result is the most important thing. But they assert this and never explain why that's the case. Obviously, we in the democracy all around the world recognize this through the existence of courts, through the existence of judiciary, that there is a limitation on how much democratic will can actually influence the political decision-making process. And the reason for this is that there are much more important things. For example, the protection of minority rights and the fundamental human rights that are way more important than just mere electoral result. And that's something that they didn't recognize. And in terms of weighing, I want to point out, and this is deadlock breaker in the opening, just money push on, oh, government policy good, or government incentive bad. On both sides, some governments are going to be bad, some court justices are going to be bad. But the way is clear. In the instance, government is bad, there is no alternative mechanism to correct the bad decision. I.e., whenever they talk about Roe v. Wade being overturned, but that decision, even after that decision, in New York and in many states in the United States, abortion continues to be legalized because legislature have the power to be able to pass policies that make sure abortion is going to be legal. Only.
Why is continuity important if people protest about it and vote in extreme leaders that stag the court? All had to prove that social will is comparatively less divisive and extreme on the other side.
Continuity is important because it is a prerequisite for any efficacy of any policy. You get nothing done on your side of the house. Okay, so the way here is clear. Whether or not you have alternative mechanisms to correct the decision. By contrast, when legislature have bad incentive and they are able to overturn all the court decisions, obviously there is no alternative mechanism to protect minority rights under their side of the house. And that's the reason why, even if you believe there's a 50% plausible chance of opening the house that all governments are going to be bad, courts are going to be bad, you should err on the side of the king opposition. Secondly, we want to point out politicians don't capture democratic will well in most of the time. Or just says that election is legally flawed. But I think even if election is perfect, election is about many things, right? Whenever you're in election, you vote politicians on basis of economic policy and a myriad of other concerns. And that's why I think comparative of constitutional amendment, whereby you're able to have to go through referendum is much better because a referendum is about only one issue that is about constitution, so that it's like we are far better in being able to capture democratic capture. I think the other thing In terms of OO, I just want to point out OO never explained why liberalism is good, and that's why we fundamentally take it over there. Very proud to stand on closing argument.
We'd like to thank the Alfred that line speech and everyone for a great debate. Let's have another round of applause for our participants. Please leave the room. Deliberate. Thank you for a great debate. Panel, could we come to an initial poll within 2 minutes / however long it takes you guys to get it?